Nobody likes TurboTax. If you Google file taxes, it's usually the top result, which causes people to click it without thinking. What these people don't know is that TurboTax has been intentionally shoving itself in front of consumers for many years now, with a very long history behind it, including working with the IRS to make people pay unnecessary fees. And anyone you ask will tell you that they dislike TurboTax or whatever similar service they use, and yet just up until recently, everyone would still end up using TurboTax to file their taxes. In case you don't already know, TurboTax is a service created by a company called Intuit with a simple mission statement to help people do their taxes. It asks you a bunch of questions about your job, income, and general life situation, then fills out all of the complicated tax forms for you. At the end, it tells you whether you owe money or are getting a refund, and it can send your taxes directly to the IRS. But you've definitely seen at least a couple of critiques of TurboTax online. A lot of it comes down to how the platform works. Someone might go in thinking they're about to file their taxes for free, which TurboTax advertises a lot even on their Google listing. But after filing out most of the forms and going through a bunch of steps, the site suddenly tells them that now they need to upgrade. Sometimes it's because they have a student loan interest or a form from freelance work or some other thing that suddenly pushes them to TurboTax's deluxe subscription. TurboTax specifically makes their free version confusing, as in their terms of service, they state that the free version is actually only for super simple and small file returns, which nearly no person falls under. This is of course done to advertise a free version without legal trouble, but still mislead every first-time user. TurboTax actually has a second free version, as it was legally required to create a free tax filing system for lower income people, but they specifically hid it from Google searches, and that is something I'll cover a bit later in the video. But with all the tricky marketing that gets people to waste time on what they believe is a free product, especially after they've already spent like 30 minutes answering questions, most people just pay and move on. But even with all that, TurboTax is still the go-to for a lot of people. I mean, it's been around for decades, and most people just assume it's what you're supposed to use. This is because TurboTax is considered to be industry standard, and just as many other industry standard services like Photoshop, which I have my own personal beef with, it remains used no matter how disliked it actually is. But TurboTax had an actual good reason to be used when it first came out in the early 1980s. Before the internet, filing your taxes meant doing everything by yourself, by hand, having to go to the post office or the library to get all the right forms. If you had a regular job, you'd wait for your W-2 form to arrive in the mail. You'd then sit down with a calculator and pen and start working through a physical instruction booklet from the IRS. All of the wording was super technical, and if you didn't know what you were doing, it was very easy to make mistakes, which the IRS would capitalize on. And if your tax situation wasn't simple, like if you moved to states or did freelance work or had a side business, you'd have to figure out the extra forms to include and how to calculate each one correctly. It was just annoying and intimidating, and also made taxes feel like a much bigger deal than they are right now. And that is where TurboTax came in. In the early 1980s, a programmer named Michael Chipman built the first version of the software. The idea was that instead of having to read all of the IRS instructions, you just answer simple questions on the website, and the program would automatically generate the right forms for you. Intuit ended up buying the software in 1993 and turned it into what we now know as TurboTax. From there, it grew very fast. TurboTax obviously became popular because it took something that used to feel risky and very time-consuming and made it accessible to just about anyone with a computer, even those who didn't even know anything about taxes. You just answer simple questions like, did you work last year? Or do you have any dependents? It also introduced features like automatic error checks, simple refund estimates, and eventually actually filing the taxes so you could submit your return digitally instead of mailing them as usual. Seeing this rise of TurboTax, other companies tried to compete like H&R Block or TaxAct, but they were just too slow, as people who used TurboTax once often stuck with it since their info was saved, the site was familiar, and it still felt like it was built to actually help you file and not yet to sell you stuff. Which of course changed drastically over time. While this was more about the internet becoming more of a marketplace and not necessarily just TurboTax turning greedy, the platform still became more focused on upselling, especially with its amount of loyal and dedicated users. This didn't happen all at once and would come in with little changes here and there, but it's the reason a lot of people who've used TurboTax for years now begin slowly disliking it. But without a better tax filing tool, TurboTax could literally do whatever they wanted and would still remain on top. In the early 2000s, the IRS launched something called a Free File program. It was supposed to let lower-income Americans file their federal taxes for free using commercial software. And TurboTax was part of this. On paper, this sounded fine. Companies should offer a free version of their software to people who earned below a certain threshold, and in exchange, the IRS agreed to not build their own tool to keep these services in business. This deal stayed in place for nearly 2 decades, but in actual practice, it did not work the way most people assumed it did. TurboTax offered a free file product, but it was intentionally super hard to find. Most users ended up on the main TurboTax site, which had a different version called Free Edition. Despite the name, that version was the one that only covered the most basic tax situations, as I mentioned previously. If you had things like student loans, unemployment income, or freelance work, all obviously super rare for people to have, you'd be prompted to upgrade. And the actual free version, which the IRS forced on them, was hosted on some separate URL with no link from the home website, and in some years, it was even hidden from Google search results entirely through specific engineering, although less is known about that. Intuit was later investigated for this, and in 2022 were ordered to pay $141 million to settle claims that they had misled people into paying for returns they could have filed for free. While all of that was happening, TurboTax also spent millions of dollars lobbying Congress to make sure that the IRS never developed its own free tool. In public, they would argue that a government-ran tax filing program would create a conflict of interest, saying it wouldn't be fair for the IRS to calculate your taxes but then also collect them. But the real and obvious reason was that if the IRS had a working free system, most people just wouldn't use TurboTax at all. So a lot of income Intuit would make was actually spent behind the scenes to make sure the IRS stayed out of their way. All of this was later heavily investigated and led to serious public and federal backlash for TurboTax. The idea of the IRS making its own filing tool has been talked about for years, but nothing ever came of it, and it never seemed like it would, due to the insane amounts of money that these tax filing services would pay. The IRS actually wanted to make their own filing system, to be in control of it, but also to make paying taxes more accessible to all Americans to obviously make more profit. That all started to change in 2022 when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. Congress had urged the IRS in previous years to develop their own system, and this new legislation would give $80 billion in funding to the IRS, with a couple million set aside for the IRS to study whether it could build a free, government-ran tax filing system. That study eventually led to a prototype, and by early 2024, the IRS launched something called Direct File and ended their partnership with TurboTax completely. At first, this program was only available in 12 states and worked for people with very simple returns, mostly W-2 income, no serious deductions, and no gig work or self-employment. But even in that limited form, the feedback was super positive, as it was simple, fast, and obviously free. Later that year, the IRS announced that it was expanding the program, and in 2025, Direct File rolled out to 25 states. They also began open sourcing the code, meaning other developers could inspect or even contribute to the system, which you can even find right now on GitHub. This, of course, was a massive thing for people in the US. If you had a typical tax situation, you could now file your federal taxes without going through a company like TurboTax, without all the ads and confusing systems. TurboTax, of course, did not like this. They didn't say much publicly at first, but behind the scenes, the company and others in the industry began trying to push back on this. These groups would increase their lobbying efforts. Some lawmakers began calling the program unnecessary or even harmful, arguing that the IRS shouldn't be allowed to act as both a tax collector and tax preparer. There were calls to defund Direct File or cap its expansion, but at that point, people saw that the IRS had a working system, they liked using it, and these results were hard to argue with. TurboTax, realizing it was about to lose, tried shifting its strategy quickly, and the company leaned harder into more premium services, so things like live help from tax professionals, advanced tools for business owners, and more integrations with financial products. It also started highlighting areas where Direct File could not compete, like multi-state filings or very complex deductions. For people with complicated returns, TurboTax is still faster than doing everything manually. But for simple filers, the group which made up a large portion of TurboTax's user base, it was no longer the only option, and it could be argued that it now wasn't even an option in the first place. All of this is still ongoing, Direct File is still expanding, and while it doesn't support every situation yet, it's promised to get more features over the next few years. The IRS has already said it plans to add support for more income types and more states, which could even encourage other countries who don't have this yet to do the same. The reason for the topic being brought up again recently is due to the recent tax season, with people starting to push for Direct File a lot and comparing it to the $90 TurboTax. This also became a political issue, which was talked about by the presidential administration, which made more people aware of its existence. But let me know what you think about this and whether TurboTax deserves its place or whether Direct File is objectively better, and thank you for watching.